Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. For any anime fan, this is a series that needs no introduction. An absolutely iconic series of its time created by Bone Studio back in 2009, this series has stood the test of time and become a definitive classic for anime fans. For any new anime fan, this is the #1 series someone will probably recommend to you if you want to get into anime as a whole. Yet, there is another Fullmetal Alchemist. And no, not just the manga, I mean Fullmetal Alchemist 2003. A series that has seemed to have fallen into relative obscurity amongst modern anime fans. Which is kind of strange, because I recently finished it, and I actually found it was a genuinely underrated gem. And I don't think it's deserving of all the hate it gets. Sure, you're going to get a lot of haters that say, oh, you shouldn't bother with it. You shouldn't watch it because it's not the quote-unquote source material, even though they've never bothered to watch the series for themselves. However, after watching both series, which is better? This video, we're going to figure out if Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is better or worse than Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is the anime for Fullmetal Alchemist that was made by Studio Bones, the same studio who made Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, both of which were adapted from the Fullmetal Alchemist manga, which was created by the lovely Hiromu Arakawa, as pictured here. But it was done back in 2003, very, very early on into Fullmetal Alchemist's manga run. So there was a lot of stuff that hadn't been finished yet, and thus, the writers decided that they would create their own anime-only ending, and that was the goal from the beginning. And thus, there's a lot of anime-only content that is in 2003, which is why many people who haven't seen it give it a great amount of skepticism nowadays. However, the general consensus is that the first half that expands on the early parts of the manga, or about the 12 first episodes of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, is generally a lot better than the second half of the series, which gets more into the anime-only stuff a lot more, and the original ending that was created for the series. And after watching 2003 for myself, I'm inclined to agree with this sentiment. However, I wouldn't say that the second half is like completely trash as some people will over-exaggerate it as, but I do think that the first half is a lot better. In fact, I would argue parts of it are better than Brotherhood, which is also the general consensus, mostly because many people find the first 12 episodes or so of Brotherhood to be rather rushed. I think 2003 is generally considered better because it expands a lot more with a lot of anime-only content on the characters, and so we feel like we're bonding with them a lot more. Almost more like a seinen anime than a shonen action series. If there's one part that many people would say is just straight up better in 2003 than Brotherhood, is the introduction. The first couple episodes that introduce the series in 2003 are a much better hook overall to Brotherhood's introduction. And so with Brotherhood, the first 2 episodes sort of introduce us to the story and characters a bit, and alchemy, and then introduces us to the Elric brothers' backstory. Whereas that's done in the first 3 episodes in 2003. In the Brotherhood, this was done with the Freezing Alchemist episode, which was an anime-only episode created to introduce a lot of different plot points. Sometimes not necessary plot points that we should be worrying about at this point. And while many people criticize it as a bad quote-unquote episode because it's kind of rushed and introduces a lot of things really fast, when I watched it with my mom, who is completely negligent to anything anime-related, she found that the introduction, when I told her about this sentiment, she was surprised because she liked the first episode and felt it was a good, quick introduction to the universe and characters and whatnot. And thus, I think the first episode of Brotherhood succeeds with the intention that I think the writers were going for, which was just to quickly introduce everything. But 2003 just introduces the plot at a much more natural and interesting rate. With the first episode of 2003, we first meet the brothers as they're coming in to the town of Liore. You might notice if you've watched Brotherhood that in Brotherhood the Liore arc is after their backstory, but just bear with me. The first 2 episodes of the Liore arc. So, the Brotherhoods come to town, and of course, you know, we get to see them fix the radio, which they then introduce to alchemy, which is a very, very simple power system where, you know, it's equivalent exchange, you put something in the circle, you get an output, simple as that. And then we're introduced to the Philosopher's Stone, which breaks this rule, and the brothers want it for some reason. And so then we meet Rose, and we are, as the viewer, are in Rose's shoes when we're introduced to the brothers. Because when Ed pulls out his notebook and starts reading off this crap about ammonia or whatever, we're as confused as Rose here. We're like, what's he talking about? Whereas in Brotherhood, we already know what he's talking about because the Eoria arc is afterwards. And so when Rose is listening, we're like, oh shoot, he's talking about human transmutation to her. So we feel like we're seeing this as a third-person view outside of the scene. Whereas in 2003, we're put in Rose's shoes with her as she's talking to the brothers. And she's getting bits and pieces of the type of people they are, but not really seeing the whole picture until it's finally revealed when Ed takes off his coat in that really sick pose, and Cornell reveals that the brothers had committed the taboo, which is why Ed's missing his arm and leg, and Al is in a suit of empty armor. And I really like how this is introduced. We're just put in the same position as Rose. We are as clueless about our heroes as her, which is a really cool way to introduce them. And then after that, of course, the Leoria arc finishes up as you'd expect. They beat Cornello, they tell Rose to move forward, and it's a really great scene. Now, overall, I think that 2003's version of the introduction is definitely better than Brotherhood's, but I also think people hate too much on the Freezing Alchemist episode when they don't consider the objectives with it. The Freezing Alchemist episode was just meant to be a quick introduction to introduce everything. And I do think that it does that very well. Overall, while I don't think the Freezing Alchemist episode is bad or anything, I do think that 2003 introduces and hooks the audience much better. It does it very naturally and just introduces the characters very naturally and gives us a lot of mystery around why are the Elric brothers in the state they are. Still, I can't be overly critical about the Freezing Alchemist episode. I think it does its job perfectly fine. It's a perfectly fine episode that introduces the plot nice and quick, and I don't really have anything bad to say about it. However, there is one part of 2003 that I would say is absolutely 100% objectively better than Brotherhood. And that is, of course, their backstory with committing human transmutation. In Brotherhood, we get to see them commit human transmutation, of course, but we only get like a little bit of time with their mom before she just dies off camera, But in 2003, all of episode 3 is just dedicated to just bonding with the Elric brothers as their kids and bonding with their mom. In fact, the mom, Trisha Elric, she gets way more screen time than Brotherhood. She's much more present. She's present in the kids' lives. We see her have fun with them. And it makes it more tragic when we physically see her succumb to her illness and die. It's not something that happens off screen. We see it happen, and it's really heartbreaking. And then we get to see the brothers go down this path of darkness before they commit the taboo and ultimately lose their bodies. Compare this to Brotherhood, it's honestly a night and day difference. We're not as bonded with the brothers at this point and Trisha, so it doesn't feel as tragic. To the point where it kind of upsets me that Studio Bones decided not to write their backstory in the exact same manner as they did in 2003. Yes, there was a lot of anime-only stuff, and they're trying to go for a more loyal to the manga type writing, but I think that this was a bad call for this one episode. I really wish they didn't change a thing, and I'm honestly kind of fuming now because of just how good Fullmetal Alchemist 2003's backstory episode was. From there, the timeline of Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is a bit different, because we actually don't flash forward again to when the brothers are 15 like we do in Brotherhood. They actually have a few episodes for when they're 12, and they change around the timeline. Like, the Tucker incident happens when they're 12, we get to see the train arc and the Yoki arc, and then they finally flash forward again a few episodes later back to 15 years of age, of course. And these episodes just expand a lot on these early episodes that we see in Brotherhood, about the first 12 episodes or so. And we get a lot more time to bond with the characters. Characters that aren't as explored as much get explored more, like Sheska and Maria Ross, for instance, and we get to bond with them a bit more. And I really like that. Does that mean that 2003 is objectively better in this regard than Brotherhood? Well, no. While I do think that Brotherhood did indeed rush a lot at the first 12 episodes, I don't think that means the first 12 episodes are bad. I just think it means that the pacing the writers were going for was a lot faster, so they didn't really have that time to like stretch it out. In fact, 2003 I think had to stretch out things, because if they didn't, it would end pretty quickly because they had a very limited amount of source material to work for at the time. A lot of the early source material they're working with is covered up until about episode 25 to 28-ish of 2003. And after that point, we start getting into a lot more of the anime-only content. But overall, I think the first half of Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is really well written, and I can understand why a lot of people will watch the first half and then switch to Brotherhood, even though I think that's ridiculous. However, then we get into the second half, and a lot of people crap on it, because a lot of people say, oh, this is why Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 isn't good, it's because of the second half, it's disappointing, or blah blah blah, without really understanding it. And when you compare it to Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, it's easy to see why. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood just delivers on all the mysteries and intrigue with the military so well compared to 2003. But I suppose I should explain more specifically what I believe the problem is. And I think the problem comes to the villains. When you look at the final villains of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, like Father and King Bradley, and compare them to the villains of Fullmetal Alchemist 2003, Brotherhood just delivers so much better on all the mysteries and intrigue with the military, and all the darkness and why the homunculi are going after Philosopher's Stones, whereas with Fullmetal Alchemist 2003, it doesn't feel as satisfying, those answers. To feel like the military isn't really involved, it's just Fear Bradley, and King Bradley isn't really like that prevalent of a character throughout the series, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So while there are many reasons why people say that the second half isn't good, you know, like, oh, the Frank Archer cyborg or whatever, I would say the core reason comes down to the villains just being kind of, well, mid. And I don't think that's true for all the villains. I think there's actually some really great villains in Fullmetal Alchemist 2003. One of those being Sloth, who was introduced on the later end, but Sloth is really interesting because in 2003, homunculi are the result of failed human transmutations, and so when Ed and Al committed human transmutation when they were kids, it resulted in a homunculus that resembled their mother. Sloth is the direct result of Ed and Al's sin of human transmutation. And so having that active consequence related to it is super interesting, and it makes for a really, really interesting, tragic character. And I really like this concept, to the point where I think Sloth is a much better villain in 2003 than Brotherhood. Although admittedly, we're not setting the bar very high. This is Brotherhood Sloth we're talking about. Not only that, but Lust is an even better character in 2003. Well, partially because she doesn't get aura farmed and killed at the start by Roy, but Lust has some interesting dynamics with Scar later on, her feelings for him, and trying to figure out if she's human or not, or can become human again. Although I really don't like how that concluded, though, with Lust and Sloth dying, with this open-ended question of were they really human or not, after the brothers end up defeating Sloth and killing her. And I don't really like this, because yes, this is a super interesting question of, do they really have souls, the homunculi, or are they just the composition of other souls? I just don't like this, because I was so attached to Sloth and Lust as characters, because they were such good tragic characters that utilized this concept of homunculi being the result of failed human transmutations. And this concept, in theory, should be a more interesting one than Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood's concept for homunculi, which are really, they're just grunts of Father who are created from Philosopher's Stones that Father's created. Like, sure, they're very cool characters, but admittedly, they are just kind of the bad guys of the series, whereas we have these more interesting tragic characters in the form of Sloth and Lust. Yet, I think that the execution wasn't the best for all the homunculi. Take Envy, for example. He's kind of a bastard throughout the series, but then they try to turn him into this tragic character because, oh, it turned out he was secretly Ed's half-brother from, you know, Hohenheim being alive a long time ago, and then Envy was the result of that or whatever. And then we have Wrath from 03, which Wrath from 03, cool idea, Izumi's child, but just not very well executed, and it just felt really sudden when Wrath suddenly became bad after eating the Philosopher's Stones, and I don't know, the writing on Wrath could have been much better. And then there's Greed, who I feel was just killed off way too quickly. And finally King Bradley, who just isn't really present in the plot all that much. Sure, he's the head of the country, but compared to Brotherhood, King Bradley, he is present from the get-go. And we can feel his presence and his grip on the country throughout the series, from him taking down Greed to sticking up and deciding not to help Lust during her fight with Roy and other stuff. He's just like pulling the strings in the first half, and we can notice it. And then Gluttony, well, I mean, it's Gluttony, but I do think they did more stuff with him in Brotherhood, so Gluttony is definitely better than Brotherhood. But I don't like how the writers tried to turn too many of the homunculi into tragic characters, and like specifically with Envy, because they made Envy like, oh, Envy's also a tragic character. That doesn't really make sense to me. Envy was always a bastard from the start, so when they suddenly pulled that out, I was like, I don't know, that's kind of hard for me as a watcher of the series to really believe. So while I think the concepts introduced in 2003 are really great, I felt the execution was very mixed in terms of the homunculi. But then we of course have the main villain, Dante. Dante had been extending her life by using the Philosopher's Stone to steal people's bodies for herself, and she was planning on doing the same to Rose at the end of 03. Now, honestly, she's a pretty mid-main villain. And again, she suffers from that same issue that King Bradley suffers from, of just not really being present until the very end. And I think that's where the problems begin. Dante is just kind of put in as this convenient answer for all of the events in Brotherhood and the mystery. And I don't like this, because in Brotherhood, Father, he's present for like half the series, and then when all the mysteries are revealed, we're like, oh, so that's what that transmutation circle from Xerxes meant, and that's why Father exists, and stuff like that, when we get like Hohenheim's backstory and whatnot. Compare this to 2003, where Dante is just going around hijacking bodies, and that's the big mystery behind everything. I mean, it works, but it's not a very interesting concept for a villain. In fact, it's a rather generic one. Heck, I mean, she just kind of exists for like the last 10 episodes she's introduced for, and even her final fight, quote-unquote, with Ed is just a quick skirmish before she basically sends him to the other world. Which, admittedly, the other world concept was interesting, where alchemy's power comes from our world, which is technically a parallel dimension, and it comes from the death of our world. But I don't know, it was a really strange concept, and I didn't really like how they tried to connect it with our world. It felt really strange for me. But overall, Dante was just really mid. Heck, she died in a really mid way. After her plan went to hell, she was like, oh shoot, I gotta get out of here. And then as she was trying to escape, she ended up getting killed by Gluttony because, well, reasons. And sure, the ending was alright. It was a really decent lukewarm ending, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I wanted it to. Not because the ending itself was bad, but because all the villains and mystery behind the ending felt very convenient. Dante just felt like an overly convenient answer to the plot, where Brotherhood's answer to all the mysteries in the form of Father and the government were all very interesting and kept us on the edge of our seats when we were watching Brotherhood the first time. Oh, also, while I'm on the topic of bad villains, I guess I should mention Frank Archer. Worst character of the show. He supposedly gets absorbed into the Philosopher's Stone, but then lived somehow. I don't think that's how it works, and then he's just a cyborg now? I don't know, man. Even with all of this, it still has a complete ending. I just think that the ending of Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 just felt unsatisfying, because the final boss and objective that we have to go over to get to the end feels very unmemorable. And so while I felt really attached to all the characters that were here from the start, all the villains they introduced towards the end, or what they did with the villains at the very end, just felt kind of mediocre. And so the ending, while the ending is a complete ending, it felt a bit wasted. Still though, there were aspects of the second half of the series I did quite like, such as the Flame Alchemist episode where we got to see Roy, Mustang, and the boys chill. We got to see Scar's death, which was a really interesting one, and of course Al becoming a Philosopher's Stone. Those were all very interesting parts of the story that definitely kept me engaged. But admittedly, compared to the first half, it was nowhere near as good as I wanted it to be. Okay, I'm being rather hard on 2003 now all of a sudden. Does that mean the second half is bad? Well, no, to be honest. In fact, there was a lot I did like about it, but as I stated earlier, I just felt that it was being held back by its villains quite a bit. And so I've come to the conclusion that Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is definitely better than 2003. I'm sorry, 2003 fans. I know you're wanting me to say that 2003 is a sleeper. It's better than Brotherhood secretly. I'm sorry. As good as it is, it's not. However, I also believe that all the hate and slander that 2003 gets is completely unjustified. This is a good series, any way you look at it, and it is honestly just criminal it's fallen into obscurity. Sure, age and whatnot has definitely contributed to that, but a lot of it also comes down to people just judging it by other people's opinions or the fact that it's not source material or whatever, and I think that's unfair. So if you're a fan of Brotherhood, you should give 2003 a try. I know I've given the second half a bad rap, but there's still so much good stuff I haven't even touched on. And a lot of that also comes from the second half of the series. Sure, it's far from perfect, but I mean, I would take Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 over generic Isekai number 520 on Crunchyroll. That's obviously just gooner bait for the average Isekai fan, but hey, that's just me. Anyways, so with all that said, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is probably the better show, but Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is still a really great anime that you should check out if you're a Fullmetal Alchemist fan, and that is just deserving of more love. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.